And I'd like to recognize our workshop planning team. So the Division of Coastal Management District Planners had a big part in putting these workshops together. As you might remember, we were trying to do these in person back in the spring of 2020, and of course, COVID changed all of our plans. And we've worked real hard to put these workshops into a virtual format for you, so thanks for joining us. So our district planners include Charlene Owens from the Elizabeth City office, Rachel Love-Adrick from the Moorhead City office, and Mike Christianberry from the Wilmington office. We've also had a lot of help from Zofia Kanorak, who is a PhD student at UNC. She's also been an intern working with me on some grant writing things. So thank you, Zofia, for your work on this. As I mentioned, all these workshop materials are online, including the recording from Tuesday. If you go to the webpage, I put that in the chat box, you'll see these notepads. These are Word documents you can download. The first one is a notepad you can take or write your notes in while we interview the funders, and you can either print those out or type in there. And then as Sophia goes through the grant writing tips that are sprinkled throughout the agenda, you can also use that notepad. And we've also got some resources on here. The site plan will pull up later when we interview the funders, so you can download that. Also, we have a grant opportunities quick fact guide, funding source comparison chart, and grant management tips document. So be sure to check those out. We did spend some time putting those together for you. All right, let's review our objectives for today. We're going to learn what makes a successful grant proposal, learn about grant opportunities for communities to require land and make improvements to beach and waterfront access, parks, and boating facilities, learn how to leverage funding from multiple grant sources, and network with funding agency representatives to help inform grant proposal development. And I know that this networking is not real easy in this virtual format, but these funding representatives who are speaking today and who spoke last week are super nice, helpful people. They've been really kind with their time in putting these workshops together. So don't hesitate to reach out to them if you need to float a proposal idea or have questions about their funding. So our agenda today is first we'll hear about the North Carolina Division of Coastal Management Beach and Waterfront Access Grant Program, and Rachel Love-Adrick will be representing that program this morning. We'll have grant writing tips, assembling and polishing the application. We'll hear about the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, which used to be the Clean Water Management Trust Fund, and Justin Mercer will be with us this morning. We'll have a coffee break at around 10:30 a.m., and just note that time might change, but it'll be around 10:30 a.m. We'll hear about the Water Resources Development Grant Program from Amin Davis with the Division of Water Resources. We'll have another grant writing tips section. There is a successful proposal and also worksheet for you to fill out on that webpage. So hopefully you had a chance to look at that before the workshop. If not, I encourage you to look at it during the break, and we'll talk about that later today. Then we'll hear about the Land and Water Conservation Fund from Chris Schmidt with the Division of Parks and Recreation, and we'll get you out of here at 12 p.m. So with that, I just had to put a couple more grant writing jokes in here for you to look at. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing the presentation. And now we will switch over to our first interview. So our first interview this morning is with Rachel Love-Adrick. She's a district planner with the Division of Coastal Management, and she'll be talking about the Division of Coastal Management's Beach and Waterfront Access Grant Program. So thank you for being here this morning, Rachel.
Morning.
So our first question is, what does the Beach and Waterfront Access Program fund?
So the goal of the program is to provide pedestrian access to the state's beaches and waterways. And we fund land acquisition and easements, and then site improvements such as dune crossovers, piers, boardwalks, parking, both on and off-site, restrooms, canoes and kayak launches, and then a variety of amenities like benches and bike racks and trash cans and lighting. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And then we also fund boat launch facilities. Those are a little different because we have to make sure that the pedestrian access is the major component. So I would always call if you have a question about any boating facilities.
Is there an example project that you could share with us?
Yeah. So over the past few years, we've had some communities that have been working to just repair and replace their dune crossovers to make them more handicap accessible. And then some other examples include projects where there's more components. So New Bern recently completed a project at Martin Marietta, and that was a kayak launch, a parking lot, a restroom, and a picnic shelter. And I did want to add, if there's ever, those larger projects where you think maybe I can't complete this in one phase, we could always phase out a project and do it in pieces.
Thanks. So where does your funding come from?
So we received 5% funding from the Parks and Recreation Trust Fund, Cardiff, and that's from the state appropriations that they receive.
Great. And how much money is available every grant cycle?
It varies what we receive. It varies each year, but over the past several years, we've been able to fund $1 million.
Great. And to everyone out there, if a question comes to mind while we're talking, just shoot it in the chat box and we'll get to it after the end of the questions here. So who is eligible to apply for your funding?
So counties and municipalities within the 20 coastal counties, and they have to have public trust waters within their boundary.
All righty. So can you briefly describe the RFP and elements expected in a proposal and maybe highlight what you feel are the most important aspects of the application?
Yeah, so we have a pre-application and a final application. The pre-app is going to ask for your project description, a location. You're also going to be asked for a budget. And then there are some various maps, like a project location, where it is regionally and in the vicinity of the town or outside of the town, and then a site plan. The final application goes into some more details. It's going to ask more about who owns the property and property ownership. And then it's also going to require government approval prior to submittal. So some of the highlights I would say is your project description. Give the background why this project is necessary. Describe your project in detail, because I have to then describe it to other people. So if I can't describe it to other people, that's going to be a problem. And then the budget. So when working on your budget, I would recommend that you get some quotes. If you underestimate the project, that could potentially be money that the town has to put into the pot, or even potentially I've seen projects that don't go forward because they fall short of funding. When you're working on your budget, I'd pay attention to the matching requirements, which I'll go over next. We have some kind of different matching requirements, and then you can include a contingency, which of 5%, and I would recommend that because the pre-apps are due in April, and then you wouldn't get a contract until perhaps January or February of the next year. So costs could have changed over that time period.
Thanks. And can you go over those match requirements with us and if there's any limits on matching?
Sure. So our matches, they vary based on the project type. For land acquisition, the match is 15% of the total project cost. And then we do offer a reduced match for Tier 1 communities and counties, and those are ones that they've been considered economically distressed by the Department of Commerce. So for site improvement, the match is 25% of the total project cost, and then we also offer that 10% reduced match for Tier 1 communities. So for limits on matching, at least half of the match that we require has to be cash. The remainder could be in-kind match. And then we also allow state and other federal monies to be used as a local match, and that's really how a community could leverage different grant sources and reduce their cash match.
So do you have any insights on leveraging money from multiple grant sources? Has your grant program been leveraged with other sources in the past?
What I would recommend is look for overlaps between the various grant sources. I know when we go over this, the site plan, at the end of the day, you'll see a lot of overlaps. There's a lot of overlaps between the Parks and Recreation Trust Fund and what we fund. Even some with Big P, there's some overlap. So that's what I would recommend, is really look and see how these different grant sources could be used to complete a project. I know our grant has been used to leverage. It's just, I've been here 5 years, so I think it was before my time. So I don't really have a good example of that.
Okay, so can you talk a little bit about your RFP proposal submission and funding allocation timing?
Sure. Like I said, there's a pre-app and a final app. The pre-apps became available on January 12th, so those are up on our website now. They are due April 16th of this year. The pre-apps are then reviewed and applicants are invited back to submit a final application. Final applications are typically sent out in May, and they're typically due in August. Applicants are notified in November or December that they've received a grant, and then the contract would go out like February or January, February of 2022.
And I believe those dates are on one of those documents on the website, right, that compares the different funding sources. Yeah, so
Yeah.
Folks can refer to that to look at those timings for the different grants. Let's see. So you did explain that there's a pre-app and a final app. Anything else about the application process people should know?
No, just if any questions ever pop up, I would recommend just to call one of us, because we're more than happy to help you walk it through and figure it out.
Thanks. Any COVID impacts to the funding or program efficiencies?
We did move our due date last year back to accommodate, because everyone was trying to figure out how to work from home when our application was due, and we thought, let's move it back. It's yet to be seen if funding has been impacted by COVID. I have heard from a number of local governments that the price of labor and materials that they had previously quoted has gone up dramatically, and then there's also some unknown in their local budgets.
And then I assume any of the district planners, you, Mike, or Charlene, can be contacted if people have questions about their application?
Yeah, and I just saw someone put a comment about the website, so I'll put that up in a minute. But here is the contact information. Oop. I'll do that when we're done.
Yeah, that sounds fine. It's hard to do two things at once,
yeah.
Especially in a webinar.
Well, I copy-pasted something else.
So can you acquire land with this funding, or is it only for these access amenities?
You can acquire waterfront land. So anytime you acquire new land with our grant, you'd have to put a deed restriction on the property that says it's for in perpetuity for use for public access.
All right, and so now I'm going to share the site plan. So give me just a moment. And while this is loading, I'm going to read the site plan scenario for everyone. There's a 4.4 acre site adjacent to downtown along the beautiful river that has become available for purchase. The site has approximately 450 linear feet of shoreline and is vegetated with lawn grasses except for a half-acre freshwater wetland located along the western property line. The beautiful river at this location is designated a Blueway Trail. The trail has a kayak launch, facilities, primitive camping platforms along the river, east and west of the site. The site is located about 5 miles upstream from a major boating waterway. The town desires to utilize the site as a waterfront gateway to downtown with accessible amenities for all age groups. The town has worked up a concept plan indicating desired improvements and is now seeking funding to acquire and develop the property. So could you walk us through this site and what this grant program would fund on this site?
Yeah, so I'm just going to start and kind of move around. We would fund the site acquisition. There's a lot that we would fund on here. We would fund the site planning, so this is the site design, the engineering, and the permitting. For shoreline improvements, we would fund the fishing pier, the bulkhead, the boardwalk, and the canoe kayak launch. For parking, we would only fund regular parking. For the other site improvements, we would do utilities, restrooms. We would even do the septic drain field if it was part of the restroom development, showers, laundry facilities, picnic shelters, the concrete walkways. We would do all of the site enhancements, the landscaping, the furniture, the lighting, the signage. I should have said what we wouldn't fund. It would be a shorter list. And then for the boating facilities, there's potential that we could fund day docks and transient docks. And like I said earlier, they would have to be part of a project where pedestrian access is the main component, because that is the focus of our program. But there's a potential to fund those.
Great, thank you. There's a question in the chat box. Is the acquisition of an easement for access eligible for this funding?
Yes, we do help fund easements, and it would be the same match as acquisition, 15%.
All right, and my last question is, do you have any grant management tips for those who are awarded funding?
The first one, this is what I say to everybody, and I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but don't spend any money outside of your contract period. There's very specific items that we can fund outside of your contract. So if you ever have any questions, reach out to us, but it's best to wait until you have your fully executed contract. If there's any issues that arise during your project, contact your grant administrator. We are happy to help you work through those issues. It could be that you need an extension or you need to amend something with your project or your budget. So don't wait. Bring that to our attention right away to give us some time to help you work through it. And then I would recommend keeping organized with your invoices and any of your receipts, and that will help you when it comes time at the end to get paid. It'll help with the process.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Rachel's going to go ahead and put their program's website and contact information in the chat box for you, so I'll give her a moment to do that. And I'll also give everyone another moment to put any questions in the chat box. And if anything comes to mind later, just let us know, and we'll answer those either during the workshop or afterwards.
Hey, Whitney, can I just add a real quick something?
Of course. Go ahead, Mike.
To the end of what Rachel was just talking about, being organized and whatnot. I think that's especially true, at least from my perspective, the communities that include in-kind match as part of their budget. Be sure to try to have a game plan as that project begins so that you're able to keep up with the dollar amounts for your in-kind match, because you're going to have to show that at the end when you're closing out the project. And a lot of times communities are scrambling to try to figure out how they can justify that in-kind. So just kind of have a game plan in mind for that.
Thanks, Mike. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box. Let me just look at it one more time.
Well, that got kind of messy, but those are the contacts.
Okay, and I believe we're putting a document together later with all those contacts in it, so stay tuned for that. All right, thank you so much, Rachel. Appreciate your time with that. Now we're going to switch gears, and I opened this icebreaker poll at the beginning of the workshop, so I'm going to close the poll and show you the results. And so hopefully you can see that. The question is, what is the most difficult part of grant writing? And so let's see, 6 people said finding funding sources that fit my project. 9 people said figuring out the budget. 7 people said writing the proposal. 4 people said finding match. One person said waiting to see if I'm funded. Yeah, that's like sitting around twiddling your thumbs, right? Trying to figure out if you're actually going to get to do the project or if you have to write another grant proposal. And 8 people said all of the above. So thank you for participating in that. Now I am going to turn it over to Zofia, who's going to give our first grant writing tips presentation of the morning.
Good morning, everybody. Okay, let me get this shared. Okay. So last week, during the grant writing tips sections, we talked about strategies and tools for getting started. And then we looked at the components of a pre-proposal, which are sort of the broad components of a full proposal. And we also talked about leveraging. So this week, we're going to talk about the final components, sort of polishing and assembling your proposal, the intangible qualities of a successful proposal. And then during the homework section, we're going to dive a little deeper into the specific components of a proposal, and we'll finish with the components of clear writing. So we're both sort of building our knowledge base and sandwiching information, sort of like a club sandwich situation. Okay, so in terms of assembling and polishing, my biggest recommendation is just to follow the directions. Like, again, last week we talked about using your eyes to read the directions, and that is true from sort of beginning to end of grant writing. Frequently, so this picture is just a screen grab of the Part F, application. So they frequently, they being funders, will actually put in a checklist for submitting a complete application. And that's because they want complete applications. They don't want you to have gone through all of the trouble to put together a mostly complete application and just be missing one thing for them to have to throw it out and not even be able to give you reviews. That would be really frustrating for everybody involved, right? The funders want you to be successful, right? Like, that's their job, is to give out the money to the best projects. And so their best situation is to have as many good projects to choose from. Okay. And then once you have assembled your grant proposal, it's really helpful to see if somebody else who is ideally like not super involved in the creation and drafting of the project and the proposal, to read your entire application packet cover to cover. And that sort of is just a second pair of eyes that can give you a fresh look and make sure that you're not missing something. I've had friends review things and miss like one little thing that I'm confident would have been the end all and be all for an application. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the intangible qualities of an application. And so I'm going to invite everybody to actually put in the chat, if I can find the chat for myself, what you think some of the intangible qualities of a grant application are. And by intangible qualities, I mean something that isn't explicitly written in the guidelines in the RFP. And if you're new to grant writing and don't have any grant writing experience, you can think of this sort of more generally as, what are the intangible qualities of a good writer or a good project leader? So I'll give everybody about 30 seconds at least to start putting some answers in chat while I myself look for the chat. And I might just not have it if I'm presenting. Whitney, do you know where I can look for it if I'm a presenter?
I do believe if you hover your mouse over your screen and then the bar at the top drops down, and I think you can open the chat there. And if not, I can just review the answers that come in the chat box for you.
Okay. That might have to be what happens, because I'm not having a good time finding it. Sorry.
That's okay. It's hard to present and manage all these functions. So we've got some things coming in the chat box. Chad says, selling your project, like making sure they understand like why it's important and needed. Andrew says, good mapping, a picture tells 1,000 words. Mark says, being clear on project details. Joe says information and points are well organized, clearly written, and concise. Jay Powell says telling your story project clearly with the need stated, a compelling story. Allison says concise, easy to understand language, especially for technical project descriptions. Melissa says appropriate tone, clear language, good grammar, and correct punctuation. Ernell says provide the experience or background of the grant project leader and major team members. Yeah, why are these people qualified to administer this project for sure? Amin says clear and concise narrative and project plan map. Laura says clear vision of project that connects to community planning goals. Yeah, any kind of time you can have like a strategic document that supports why something is needed is important. Renee says putting your thoughts, ideas into words that make sense. Holly says tying your project to community values or adopted plans. Melissa, concise narrative, not too wordy, but describes the need. And Cheryl says someone who is adept at describing the project and how the project helps the community.
Yeah, wow, those are all such great answers, and actually also apply to a lot of the clear writing components that we're going to discuss later. So here are some of the things that I also think of in addition to all of those things, because those are all exactly right. Just to sort of broaden how we're thinking of this a little bit more. Successful applicants often know the funder, so they have an established relationship with the funder. They've interacted either via phone or email or maybe even Zoom or in person, depending on if you're sort of in the same community as the funder. They know the field, meaning they are competent or ideally practiced, but I know that a lot of us don't have a lot of practice with the grant writing, but that's okay. You can still sort of successfully fulfill a lot of these other intangible qualities. And as I'm going through this, I want you to know that the picture on the right is sort of a metaphor, right? So nobody's expecting you to fulfill all of these qualities, right? Like this is so much. And the wonderful thing about working in a grant writing team is that you might have members of the team that bring these things to the table, and so you can have a more representative sample. But what's important to know is which of these are glass balls and which of these are rubber balls, meaning which of these things are going to bounce back up even if you maybe miss the mark or you're not totally up with the news, right, in a way that is relevant to your the program or the amount of the pot of money that you're applying to, and which ones are glass, which ones aren't going to bounce back, which ones do you really need to include in your proposal. And that's going to vary depending on your team, depending on the funding opportunity, et cetera. Okay, Whitney, will you just interject if there are other questions coming into the chat, because I'm also not seeing those. Okay, so in addition to folks knowing the field and knowing the funder, we talked about organization last week, some of the strategies that go into being a good organizer. A lot of the time, successful applicants are technologically savvy, especially nowadays with all of the reporting and application components being digitalized in some form or fashion. A lot of people talked about writing clearly and concisely. Amazing. Watching their language, I know, came up a lot. I think the demonstrating passion and collaborative efforts came through. Okay, I think this one is important. Showing potential for sustainability. So funders really like to establish relationships with the folks that they fund, right? And so if you have already perhaps gotten money from a similar organization, that can help leverage getting money from a partner organization. But showing potential for sustainability means, have you applied for funding and been successful in the past? And what were your sort of return on project inputs? But again, if you're brand new, this might be something that you don't have the opportunity or haven't had the opportunity to have proven in the past. So you could talk about potential for sustainability in other regards. It could be something maybe that isn't related to grant writing specifically, but is about projects that your organization has been involved in the past. You can talk about, we did X and that led to outcomes Y and Z along this specific timeline. Okay, so I think, and then the last thing I want to say, and this has come up multiple times, is practicing integrity and budget preparation. So we've sort of talked a lot about being specific in your budget and how if you're not specific enough or if you're too specific in the wrong ways, that might come back to bite you. So you just have to do your absolute best. I know that some of these things are sort of subjective and vague, but if you ask for help and you're sort of checking base with the funder and also with your team as you're preparing your application, a lot of these things will sort of fall into place. And so just making sure that you're giving yourself enough time to prepare the proposal, I think, helps sort of a lot of these other things fall into place. Okay, does anybody have any questions?
There's a question about sustainability. Melissa wants to know, do you mean sustainability as in long-term or as in environmental concerns?
That's a good question. I mean, in terms of long-term, the sustainability of your organization to be able to continue turning whatever funds you have acquired from a funding agency into positive impacts to the community, right? Are you fulfilling your objectives of your past projects, even if those projects didn't require funding? Like, it could just be we successfully did a outreach program, and that demonstrated our ability to engage the community in these specific ways. Did that answer your question, Melissa?
She says yes.
Cool. Okay, great. Well, that's all I have for this chunk, and I think we are back on schedule, so I will turn it back over to you. And I don't know if I need to give up my sharing. This is where you said, I see. I found the chat. It was in my second screen. Okay, cool.
Thank you, Sophia. So next up, we're going to have another funder interview. And after this funder interview, we will take our 10-minute break. So keep that in mind. So Charlene Owens, the district planner with the Elizabeth City office with the Division of Coastal Management, is going to interview Justin Mercer. Justin is with the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, which is formerly the Clean Water Management Trust Fund, and he is the Eastern Field representative. So over to Charlene and Justin.
Great. Thank you, Whitney. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Justin.
Good morning.
Great. Well, let's get started. What do you fund?
So we fund quite a bit, but maybe not everything that folks would want. We are largely focused on land acquisition, including both fee and easement acquisitions of land that protects riparian buffers, riparian greenways, natural heritage areas, historic and cultural resources, and military buffers. A quick note about greenways is we are focused on acquiring the land and not building the greenway itself. In addition, we do fund stream and wetland restoration projects as well as planning and innovative stormwater projects.
Great. Could you share an example project with us?
Sure. I'll stick with acquisition, but if anybody's interested in other program areas, please don't hesitate to let me know. A few years ago, we funded a roughly 6,000 acre piece of land on the North River in Camden County. Lots of great wetlands, lots of access for sportsmen. The property ended up going to the Wildlife Resources Commission and added to their game lands program. So certainly can fund large scale projects. On the opposite end of the spectrum, in 2020, we funded a roughly 9 acre parcel at Ocracoke that will expand an existing nature preserve and provide some additional access to the sound there at Ocracoke.
Great, thank you. So where does your funding come from?
So the majority of our funding comes from legislative appropriations, and then we do get a portion of select license plate fees. So we kind of have most of it coming from appropriations. We know that when a budget passes, and then monthly throughout the remainder of the fiscal year, we continue to receive additional funds.
Okay. And how much money is available?
It's a tough question to answer these days. Right now, our recurring appropriations are at about $13 million, and we get roughly $4.5 million in license plate revenue every year. The legislature and governor have been pretty good in past years about giving us non-recurring expansions, which unfortunately within the absence of a budget, we don't have that. So right now we're around $18 million, but in recent years we've been as high as 25.
Okay. And who is eligible to apply for your funding?
So we work with other state agencies, units of local government, and nonprofit organizations that have conservation as one of their key factors in their mission.
Okay. If you would briefly describe your RFP and the elements that are expected in a proposal.
So essentially, we just have a structured application. It's an online web form. An email goes out to our listserv every year when that's available, and that's pretty much it. The application goes through looking at different resource values on the site, obviously your budget, what the plans are for long-term use, any additional public benefits for access or education, things of that nature.
Okay. And could you highlight what you feel are the most important aspects of the application?
Absolutely. In our evaluation process, the resource score is sort of the biggest part of it, but that's also the easiest part for us to independently verify, and we definitely do that. So while that might be the most important part of your project, it's not necessarily the most important part of the application. I would suggest the most important aspects of the application are your budget. We obviously want to make sure that is accurate. And then since we do require a perpetual conservation easement on our properties, the long-term uses and planned reserve rights are definitely something that you want to make sure that you pay close attention to and think forward beyond maybe the next 5 or 10 years.
Sure. Are there match requirements?
There is no specific match requirement, but match does impact how a project scores. The average funded project typically has 50% or more in match funding, but we certainly fund projects that have less. I think one of our most recent projects had around 30% match. So if you have a strong project, otherwise there's definitely room to get away with less match if needed.
Okay.
But that is certainly one of those areas that you can improve your standing if you've got it available.
Sure. Do you have any limits on matching?
So for match, it has to be for an expense that our program would otherwise fund. So we won't fund greenway construction, so we can't consider those construction dollars as match. But if it's related to acquiring the property, we can certainly consider that.
Okay. And talking about leveraging, do you have any insights on leveraging money from multiple grant sources?
I think Rachel covered one key thing is look for that overlap, look for programs that are similar enough to be able to match together. But I would also suggest that you don't shy away from working with partners. There are a lot of situations that we come across where a local government might not have access to certain funds, but their nonprofit partner might have access to those funds. So don't shy away from that, and also plan ahead for multiple grant programs. A lot of us have similar timelines. Some folks are earlier or later than another, and I know for our program, we give extra credit, so to speak, for folks that have their match secured already. So if you know you're going to apply to us and you want to kind of balance that with others, maybe you can have some better information going in.
Sure.
Than you might have if you waited.
Sure. How has your program been leveraged with other resources in the past?
So we certainly match a lot of other grants. One thing that comes to mind that's maybe not as applicable to this group, but if other folks have similar situations, And the city of Raleigh has their own grant program for protecting water quality. And I know a lot of times they will look and see whether or not we have funded a project or what the likelihood is that we'll fund a project before they'll pull the trigger, so to speak, and decide to fund it as well. So it's kind of a back and forth as to who is going to bite first. But there's definitely there are definitely situations where folks look to see whether or not we have funded, or we look to see whether or not other organizations have funded.
Sure. So concerning your RFP, what is your RFP proposal submission and funding allocation timeline?
So the application is typically available in early December, and proposals are due by the first Monday in February, which for anybody keeping track is this coming Monday. So tight timeline, but still a chance that folks want to get something in for this year. From there, it is unfortunately a relatively long and involved process. In February, I will be doing virtual meetings and phone calls on all of the projects in my region. And then from there, in the spring, I'll do a site visit for every project, heading towards an eventual funding decision in September. As with most folks, it does take a little bit of time to get grant contracts drafted and executed. So a realistic expectation for having funding available would be the following March.
Okay. So do you have a pre-app, or is this just a one-app, final app process?
No, it's just a one-app process. It's as simple as completing the online application form and submitting it. However, the application advice or meetings is certainly encouraged. It's not a requirement, but if a potential applicant has a proposal that they would like to discuss, I'm always happy to do that and give advice where needed. We do allow for updates to landowner status and match status, usually in mid-June. So there is time to get those things in line, but otherwise it's a single application.
Right. So has COVID impacted your funding allocation or other aspects of your program?
COVID has thus far not impacted our funding allocation. That remains to be seen for this upcoming budget year. But as far as the process goes, it definitely derailed things last year with doing site visits that are usually done in person. We did shift to doing those unaccompanied, and that is the expectation for this upcoming year as well, that if I go out and see a project site, I will likely try to do that by myself, certainly with accompaniment, certainly with coordination on the landowner and the applicant end. In addition, we did add the February virtual meeting for this year. That's not something we've done in the past, but that allows us to get ahead of a lot of our questions and plan better for these solo site visits.
So you touched on acquisition grants. Are there any limitations on the type of development that can occur? I know you touched on that a little bit.
Yes. We typically expect a permanent conservation easement to be recorded on at least a 300-foot buffer from any water body, as well as any natural heritage or historical and cultural or other resources on site. Our standard easement typically allows for passive recreation. You can build trails. You can have hiking. You can have benches along your trails, that sort of thing. Any other development as far as picnic shelters or active recreation or things like that, it's possible to request at an additional reserved right, but those are subject to approval by our Board of Trustees.
Sure. Whitney, if you would go ahead and share the concept plan that we talked about at the last presentation. I'm going to touch on that again. And you should all have a print copy, perhaps, or something on your computer that shows this plan as well. So, Justin, we've already gone over the scenario, and we've heard a bit from you about this idea of a more passive recreation site. Obviously, this one is not showing up as passive, but what could your program fund on this particular project?
So we could certainly fund the natural areas of this property, the acquisition of the wetland areas. If this were a larger property, this sort of development on a small area of, say, a 100-acre parcel would not be that big of a deal. We could probably get that as an extra reserved right. However, with such a small property, I think it would be a bit of a stretch for us to fund the acquisition of the entire thing. We would also certainly participate in the wetland restoration. And if stormwater enhancement had an innovative aspect to it, if somehow you were taking a novel approach to stormwater enhancement in this area, that's potentially something that we could fund as well.
Okay. And if I'm understanding you correctly, if the amount of improvements was reduced, would that make the site more competitive for funding?
Potentially, yes. Like I said, we are typically more interested in protecting the natural areas of the property. So if it's just going to be left in lawn, that's not necessarily something that our program would be particularly interested in. But if that area is going to be allowed to regenerate into some sort of natural buffer, then we can certainly work with that. And I probably should have shared a different example earlier. We actually did fund a project recently in Cedar Point that did have some more of this development. It was a larger parcel, had a lot of wetlands, but they're also looking at doing an active events lawn area, some restrooms and things like that. So there's certainly potential. We just want to make sure that it's not the majority of the property that's going to be developed.
Sure, great. So who would our communities contact for more information or help?
I'm the best contact for anybody in Eastern North Carolina. Anything relating to the application process, it'll be my responsibility to kind of guide projects through this process from the time of project application through the time of funding. And it'll be my responsibility to actually present these projects to the trustees. So getting me involved early definitely helps to make sure that I have an adequate understanding of the project and can help provide advice when possible.
Great, great. So Whitney, do we have any questions in the chat box?
Yes. Cindy would like some clarification. Is any project idea welcome? What about a botanical garden for the community?
That's an interesting question. It would I'd be happy to discuss it one-on-one. We have funded those types of projects in the past. We actually funded the acquisition of Airlie Gardens in Wilmington back in the late 90s. However, things were done a lot differently in the late 90s than they're done today. So it would really depend on the specific situation and how much of the area could be considered natural, so to speak, versus being landscaped and planted with various species. So certainly would be happy to discuss the project, but it sounds like there may be some challenges as well.
Great. Any other questions for Justin?
I don't see any more in the chat box.
Okay, well, if we have a few more minutes, Justin, I would like to touch a little bit on grant management tips. So do you have any grant management tips for our those that would be awarded funding?
So my job typically ends after you've been funded and I pass you off to somebody else. However, I do know that communication is key. We have very frequently folks will call me after they've been funded and want to know why their contract hasn't been executed yet, and it's one, usually because they're calling the wrong person, and two, because they have in most cases left something undone. So our acquisition program staff is usually waiting on documents from the applicant or from the grantee, and that's what is slowing the process. So if you as the grantee can be on top of things and make sure you get documents completed and returned in a timely manner, that will certainly make things go a lot more smoothly. With acquisition projects, we are in the situation where we do have to depend on the state property office to review all appraisals, and that's sort of out of our hands. So the earlier we can get documents there, the faster the process can move, and the happier everybody is. And as Ashley just pointed out, we do require quarterly progress reports, so we want to know that the project is making progress. And so that's an important part of the process as well, is making sure that you're clear on those and that you've got your reimbursement requests documented appropriately.
Great. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you very much, Justin.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlene and Justin. Our next interview is with Amin Davis with the Division of Water Resources. He's representing the Water Resources Development Grant Program, and he will be interviewed by Mike Christianberry, who is the Division of Coastal Management District Planner for the Wilmington office. Over to you, Mike and Amin.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Amin. Well, let's go ahead and get started, I guess. So tell us a little bit about what you fund, and also where your funding comes from, and then maybe share an example project for us. I think you're on mute, Amin.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. The Division of Water Resources, Water Resource Development Grant Program is kind of broken up into two sections. Coastal infrastructure, which my colleague Kevin Hart oversees. Those are things like jet navigation projects, dredging, beach nourishment, coastal storm damage, things like that. But I manage the state and local projects portion of our grant program, and that's what I'm going to talk about with y'all. So we fund state and local projects. We fund 4 general categories of projects. Water-based recreation, which is probably most relevant to this workshop. We also fund stream restoration projects, including living shorelines on the coast. Water management projects, those are primarily green stormwater infrastructure and stormwater control measures, and feasibility studies that would support these eligible types of projects. So the most relevant water-based recreation projects, I guess, for this workshop would be things like greenways, trails, boardwalks, paddle access sites, fishing piers. Greenways are our most common type of project. We would also provide funding as a feasibility study for a master plan of, some kind of park development that had a water-based recreation component to it. So a project, a coastal project or a water-based recreation project on the coast that we funded is called Coast Guard Park in Elizabeth City. So Elizabeth City Parks and Rec submitted an application to us in 2018, and they were doing improvements to their city park that's located right on the Pasquotank River, adjacent to the College of the Albemarle's Boathouse, Charles Creek Park, and the Museum of the Albemarle, if any of you are familiar with Elizabeth City. So we funded construction of a 6-foot wide boardwalk with a renovated bulkhead. The driveway contained permeable pavement, pavers, and parking spaces, a floating dock, and a separate kayak and canoe launch, as well as a 78-foot, well, actually it got changed to a 30-foot fishing pier and a 16 by 16 platform, landscaping, picnic tables, and umbrellas. So that's probably one of our most comprehensive water-based recreation projects. But the most popular project we funded was actually in the town of Windsor. It was a treehouse called the Casheye River Treehouse Tree Village that was filmed by a show called The Treehouse Guys. So those are kind of 2 projects I'd like to highlight.
Oh, good. Yeah, that project up there on the Casheye River has been reported widely, so it's a very popular site for sure. Who is eligible to apply for funds?
Units of local government. So basically, counties and municipalities, county and municipal agencies. Those can include, a soil or water conservation district and the traditional, city and county agencies.
Okay. And roughly how much money do you guys have a year that you're able to award?
It ranges year to year. I'd say over the last couple of years, it's probably been around $1.5 million for just state and local projects. We also have another pot of funding for stream restoration projects that are federally cost shared through the NRCS EQIP program, but that's not necessarily relevant to this discussion.
Thank you. Briefly tell us a little bit about the RFP process and elements that are expected in a proposal.
Sure. So we don't have a formal RFP process like a lot of other grant programs do. Essentially, we post our grant guidelines towards the beginning of a grant cycle, and I'll talk about the grant cycles later. But essentially, the application submittal includes a completed application spreadsheet, scale project maps, an official signed resolution, and conflict of interest documents that are signed by the whoever has signatory authority with the local government. And in terms of kind of the most important aspects of the application, we've touched on it earlier with the questions, but from our perspective, definitely a clearly defined project narrative, as well as with corresponding project maps, because we like, essentially whatever is in the application in terms of project elements should be reflected in the project map and vice versa. And sometimes that doesn't happen, but that's a very critical component of our application review process. And also making sure that the narrative and information meets we have 7 review criteria that are laid out within the application. So it's just important that the applicant tells their story, and we basically provide our scoring and review criteria within the application so that they can best tell their story and even have an idea of how their project would, how competitive it would be based on our review criteria.
Gotcha. And are there any specific match requirements or any limitations on matching?
Yes, definitely. Ours is a little bit higher than most grant programs. We require 50% match of non-federal project costs. So if a local government wanted to submit an application to us, whatever the total project cost is, we can pay up to 50% of the non-federal cost of the project. Additionally, there was something else. And we do allow in-kind contributions, but those have to be documented, on the back end when they begin submitting reimbursement requests, and we have forms that lay that out.
Good. Are there any insights on leveraging money from multiple grant sources? And has your grant program been leveraged with other resources in the past? I did see a comment in the chat box a few minutes ago from Charlene Owens, our district planner in Elizabeth City. I think that y'all are partnered with us, or we partnered with you all on that. And I don't know, Charlene, you might can chime in a little bit too. And it seems like I remember seeing an application for that project on the Cache River too. But anyway, I'll just let you all.
Sure. Yeah, I do believe Charlene's program did provide some funding for the Cache River Treehouse project. And yeah, we honestly at least probably more than half of our projects involve other funding sources. So that's very typical, particularly with the larger projects that we fund. So a change that we did last year, because we had some issues with a particular vendor and, some issues with overpayments that happened years ago. But we don't allow, or we request, if an applicant has other sources of non-federal funding, that not to mix budget categories with funding requests to us. For instance, we fund everything from administration all the way through construction. So if an applicant already has secured grant funding for, say, design, then we're asking them not to submit funding for us for design, because that will limit the likelihood or potential for duplicate funding and so on and so forth. So and I think, I'm not sure if Justin mentioned it earlier in his presentation, but particularly with the Land and Water Fund, formerly Clean Water Management Trust Fund, any applicants that are submitting applications that have their funding, we specifically do not, want the budget categories mixed, because it can get a little bit complicated, and we've dealt with some of those issues in the past. But yeah, no, we're completely okay with, projects having other sources of funding. And so it was mentioned previously in the workshop about something about leveraging, looking for overlaps and similar funding requirements for similar type projects.
Gotcha. And I'll just make a comment too, that when you were talking about in-kind and then also leveraging, sometimes when we're looking at the applications, we're looking at also too, which, if a grant request is also funding or coming from another grant source, that depending on how it's written in those applications and also with the in-kind, sometimes all it actually is doing is just taking away actual cash towards the project and toward construction. And so sometimes you have to be careful on how those applications are written in that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I will just add, I forgot to mention one thing with regards to the match. If we actually provide points in our one of our criteria is economic benefits. So it's either under our economic or social benefits. But if an applicant does have leverage funding sources, they do get a little additional points for that.
Okay. What is the timing of your grant cycle? In other words, you indicated earlier you don't really have a RFP process per se, but are you generally on the same cycle each year in terms of timing and whatnot?
Generally, yes. So we don't have a formal RFP process, but we have essentially two application cycles every year. We have a spring that begins January 1st and ends June 30th. And then we have a fall grant cycle, which begins July 1st and ends December 31st. So as I mentioned earlier, we post our guidelines at towards the beginning of the application cycle. I will say that our spring 2021 guidelines haven't been posted, but they should be posted hopefully in the next week or two on our website. So for our spring cycle, we generally make funding notifications in October. And then in our fall cycle, we generally make funding notifications in April. So the notifications generally happen 6 months, after the beginning of the grant period, essentially. And then if a project is recommended for funding, the applicant will enter into a DEQ grant contract. And it generally takes like a month or two for execution of a DEQ grant contract. Execution just means it's signed by both the grantee and DEQ. And once that happens, the grantee is eligible to submit reimbursement requests to us, because we're a reimbursement-based grant program as our most.
Yeah, and at least I know with DEQ grants, I don't know if this is statewide or not, but with the new e-procurement system, this is the first cycle that we're going through with this process. It seems like that's taken a little bit longer with just getting used to that whole new system.
Yeah, that's a whole meeting just to talk about that. But yeah, we're dealing with that right now. I'm even dealing with that today. So yep, it has been an interesting process and transition.
Yeah. So has COVID impacted y'all in terms of your grant cycles or funding or obviously it does have you work, I guess, but
Yeah. I think the two primary ways it's affected us are that we've had a lot of what we call no-cost extension requests. There's just been lots of project delays due to COVID, so I've processed a lot of contract amendments that are specifically requesting extensions. So we allow up to a year. Our grants are typically 2 years with up to a year of a year extension. The other way it's limited, or COVID has changed our administration, is that I'm not doing as many site visits. So I do pre-application site visits with project teams before an application is submitted, primarily to answer any questions they have, but also photo document the project area for the benefit of our review team. We have six colleagues that I meet with at the end of every grant cycle to review projects, and they assist me with recommending them for funding. And then when a project is completed before closeout, I do a closeout site visit to make sure the project was done in accordance to with the application and project scope and all of that. So I haven't been doing as many site visits because of that. So we've come up with an alternative way for both pre-application and site and closeout site visits to address that remotely.
And I guess you could just do this in the chat box, but if you get a chance, if you could just enter who the main contact person would be for your grant opportunities, and but if you're kind of like us, you may have more than one person depending on what part of the state you're in. Are there any types of limitations as far as development that can occur with your grants?
Oh, go ahead.
And that's with acquisition as well. Like in terms of acquisition or with easements, do you have any limitations that can occur in terms of development?
Yeah, the short answer is not specifically, and we even though we do provide funding for our statute says land acquisition and facility development. But in the 4.5 years I've been managing this program, we haven't had one application that was really focused on acquisition. But if we did, essentially the type, the intensity, and the location of the proposed development would obviously impact the review score. So for instance, if it was a high intensity development in an environmentally sensitive area, it probably wouldn't be as competitive as if it was a low impact development project that incorporated, green stormwater infrastructure and things of that nature. So we don't, but it's kind of, those issues are taken into account in our review criteria, essentially. In terms of easements and acquisition, we do allow in-kind contribution. So if there was acquisition tied to a park water access project, then the acquisition costs could be used as in-kind match, as long as the property were purchased directly for the project and the local government didn't own it prior to the project, if that makes sense. So as long as it's done as part of the project and it's not currently owned, the cost of the acquisition or easement can be used as to meet the applicant's match requirement.
Okay. Well, good. Thank you for that. Whitney, do we have any questions that have come up in the chat box?
we don't have any questions per se. Zofia does say thank you to Amin for bringing up the review criteria that's listed in the proposal, as that could be often in other proposals as well, and something to pay attention to as you're writing your project, you know, seeing how many points are allocated to each different criteria and making sure you're hitting on those points. And then Justin Mercer says, related to the Land Water Fund and the Division of Water Resources Funds, making sure those are separated on restoration applications, like we mentioned earlier, that this is not an issue for land acquisition issues. And Amin, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Whitney. I was just going to say, Amin, real quick, if take a look at this site plan that we put together and maybe just kind of describe some of the things that your program would fund.
Yeah, this is neat and kind of easy, because we could literally fund every aspect of this project. And it's good. The fact that there's a wetland restoration and stormwater enhancement is a benefit, and would likely make that more competitive than if it didn't have those components and it was strictly recreational facility development. But this project is similar to the Coast Guard Park project I mentioned earlier, and things like site landscaping, lighted signage, all of that, would be put under our construction line item. But yeah, we could fund every aspect of this project.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much, Amin. And if there's no other questions, I guess we'll turn it back over to Whitney.
You're welcome, Mike.
All right, thank you both. I'm going to stop sharing this document, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Zofia for our last round of grant writing tips.
Yeah, and we're actually also going to go over the homework. So in a minute, but not yet, we're going to go over this answer sheet, but I wanted to bring everybody's attention to, I think, what is a really good question from Sharon, asking who usually prepares the site plans, like the example we've been using. And I don't have the answer to that because I don't know, so I'm going to let somebody else jump in, but I want to give a shout out to Charlene for coming up with this idea. It has been, I think, a really useful tool. So thank you, Charlene.
Just a word about the site plan. If you're talking about for a pre-application, ideally it's something that the local government can prepare without a lot of detail needed. That's why we really did share essentially what is a two-scale sketch drawing for everyone to look at. This is not an engineered drawing by any stretch. So for our application, certainly that pre-app process, the other option, I think it's similar to what you saw with the application, the pre-app on Thursday. You can take an aerial photograph, put some graphic images on that. Just something that's to scale, sufficient to convey what you're trying to do on the project.
Thanks, Charlene. That's really helpful. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's not necessarily a requirement that it be an engineer's drawing, but to be aware of that and look for those specifics in the application. But most of the time, just a hand drawing, as long as it's to scale. Great. Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay, well, it's 11, so let's go ahead and go over this homework. Okay, so last week we reviewed a fictional pre-proposal, and we filled out this poems chart. Oh, I realized that I had started talking about what I was wanting to eventually share without having actually shared it yet. Okay. Let me pull up the chat. Cool. Okay. Can you see both of these? Okay, great. So on the right is this chart that we filled out last week for those of you who weren't able to join us. it's basically a pared down version of the 10-point sheet. So the idea is that you can have both of these tools in your toolkit, and you can use whichever one either suits the project proposal or suits your needs at the time, right? So I could see a situation in which you would make a poems chart at the outset before you start writing as sort of an organization tool, or, and then you at the back end make sure that you can fill in your 10-point worksheet, this one right here, for your application, right? So it could be sort of a sandwiched thing. But you also might find that, okay, the application I'm putting together is actually really complex, and I really need to get these 10 points down, or at least as many of these 10 points down as I can before I start writing. So just sort of be thinking about those things as we're going over this, and when you might feel like these tools are of use to you, or perhaps not. Okay, so we, excuse me, are reviewing this Bertie County Tall Glass of Water Phase 1 development. And so I should have put a blank one up here, but I have the answer for number 1 down. So the question is, in one sentence, summarize your project idea. What will you do? When? With whom? Where? For what? And why? So would somebody be willing to come off of mute and share what they wrote for number 1? It could either be reading from my screen if you want, or you can share exactly what you wrote. Yeah, so I'm gonna give folks some time to come off mute. Don't be shy. There are no wrong answers. And I know there isn't like a raise hand function, so I can't recognize somebody. So we'll try a free for all. And if we need some sort of moderation, we can figure that out.
There is a raise hand function in the participant list.
Oh,
if you highlight on your name, a little hand comes up. And so if you want to raise your hand to answer the question, I'll monitor that for Sophia. Okay, Kevin Reed, he has raised his hand. So Kevin, come off mute and let us know.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I had simply put down provide free and open water access with amenities to Albemarle Sound near the confluence of the Showen River.
Perfect. I think that is very similar to what I came up with. It sounds like you actually did an extension of what I wrote. I made it really succinct and short. Okay, great. Thank you, Kevin, for coming off of mute, and Whitney for helping me figure this out, because I didn't realize that there was a raised chat function. Okay, great. One other thing as we're going through this, because we're going to talk about it after we're done reviewing this homework, is what are some of the qualities of this proposal that just made it a good proposal? So what are some of the just like good writing qualities, etc.? We're going to talk about those in a bit. Okay. Number 2, who are you as an organization? What is your mission or purpose? Can we get another volunteer? I see Morgan. Go ahead, Morgan.
Hey, so I think I had something really similar. So I said the organization was the Bertie County Board of Commissioners. And then I think I pulled exactly from the text where it says they're committed to improving the quality of life for all citizens and recognizes the importance of recreational activities to promote health and wellness. And I also said that they support conserving natural resources and connecting children to nature.
Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what I had. Great. Thank you for sharing. And I want to, so we're going through these 10 points, and I want to mention there's only really one page of text, right? And some of these have to do with cost, so they're dealing with the other pages of budget. But a lot of this is found in one page. It's really tight. It's really succinct. And so just be thinking about how they constructed their sentences and paragraphs and how you might be able to sort of mirror this type of rhetoric. Okay, number 3, describe the specific need or issue in your community that your proposed project addresses. I see Jay Powell. Go ahead and come off mute.
So what I had put was that as a small coastal community, water access is important to our citizens and always a need, and that this project would give people that opportunity as well as visitors to the county, which would also help drive tourism and support county functions.
Yeah, perfect. And it sounds like you might have even gone into that blueprint for Birdie where they state specifically what the plans are for those economic development plans. Good. So good job on doing that extended bit of homework. Okay, awesome. Thank you for sharing. Number 4, what specific goals will they achieve in their community as a direct result of this work? Let's see. I don't see any hands. I'll just take this one since everybody's been so good about coming off mute. So I came up with build. So they're going to build an ADA accessible ramp and walkway from the parking lot to the beach, solar powered restrooms, outdoor showers, a picnic shelter, a public beach, 2 of 7 miles of hiking trail primitive campsites with picnic tables. That's what I personally would be using, and steel fire rings and restore several acres of natural meadow. So they packed a lot in there in terms of the specific goals that they want to achieve. And they both in the application, they wrote that out in sentence form, but they also included this very nice map, right? And this is clearly an engineered map, not like the one that Charlene was just discussing. So obviously for a full proposal, it's great that they had this. Perhaps it was a requirement for Part F, I'm not sure. But they have this really nice site plan to accompany it. And somebody earlier in the chat, I think, said, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And so if you can have really informative, clear figures that enhance your proposal or perhaps communicate a similar chunk of information that's in your proposal in a different way, that's all great. Okay, great. What about number 5? What methods will you need to bring these goals to fruition? And I just want to say, starting off, that the methods were bare here, and so there's a lot of inference. But based on the information that is here, what did they need to do to bring those to fruition? Jay Powell again, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. I think what you wrote is great. I would just add that I think one of the major goals for them is also to be able to manage those leveraged funding sources.
Yes, that is such a good point. Thank you for bringing that up, because they specifically mention in their project the matching funds, right? And I think the management of matching funds is such a good thing to be thinking about at the front end, because of how complex this big project is. There's going to be a lot of moving pieces, and so knowing what is in each of the phases and how the different funding units are sort of assembled to bring it all together, yes, that's really important. Okay, but for the methods for a proposal like this, a lot of it is in the site plan. Okay, and then the details would be in the details of construction, who you're going to work with, etc. Okay, moving right along. Number 6, who else has a vested interest in working with you as collaborators on this issue or opportunity?
Sophia, just to back up a minute, Lisa said for, I'm pretty sure, number 5, bridge repairs and road repairs also.
Oh, yes, that's a great point. Yeah, so let me see. I mean, Lisa, I'll invite you to, if you want to explain a little bit more, you're welcome to, but I think that that is a really good addition. Okay. Okay, who else has a vested interest? Just with the intention to keep things moving, I'll just keep going. So Bertie County Parks and Recreation, because the kayak kiosk is going to hold their kayaks and life preservers, so they have a vested interest. Of course, Bertie County citizens, because as we mentioned up here, the mission of the Bertie County Board of Commissioners is to improve the quality of life for Bertie County citizens. So of course they have a vested interest. And then potentially also the NC Coastal Land Trust and Division of Parks and Recreation, because the properties, were conveyed to them and eventually became part of this tall glass of water. They might be interested in what the ultimate outcome of the project is. So you might want their input, or if they have some knowledge of the land, perhaps there's institutional knowledge about that site that there is worth passing on to you. Okay, number 7, how will you evaluate success? What information, tools, or data will you use to make these evaluations? And I'm also going to say that, again, this is not explicitly stated in this abbreviated proposal, and it wasn't explicitly stated in the pre-proposal last week, for our example. But for a public access use site, how would you assess the success of your project? And if you don't feel like coming off mute, it's okay if you want to share in the chat as well. Survey who is using the site and how often. Great, thank you, Morgan. Surveys, completion of the program. Yes, Lisa, you have to complete it if people are going to be able to use it. Perfect. Yeah, so these seem like really sort of intuitive things, right? Or maybe they seem obvious, but even if something seems obvious, be really explicit about how you're going to evaluate success in your proposal for 2 reasons. One, it shows maturity. It shows that you know that you have the ability to successfully complete that project. As Lisa said, you have confidence that you're going to complete it. And so the question is, okay, have I addressed the need of my community? So it shows maturity, and it's often something that gets chopped on the chopping block when space is a limiting factor. And so if you can tighten your language in other places to make sure, even if it's just one sentence, right? Like for this, it could be, we are going to, we'll perform a survey with, these 2 specific things. And it can have the details of like once a month on the 1st of every month, for 2 hours from noon to 2 or something, right? Renee says, have a traffic reader to monitor traffic use to the area. That's awesome. Architectural design construction oversight on materials, says Lisa. Jay Powell says, reservations for camping sites, kayak, and life preserver use. That's a great idea, because then you sort of have a built-in way to collect the use data. That's a great point. Okay. Finishing up, what resources do you need to do this work? The skills, labor, equipment, training, supplies, and services. And this also might not have necessarily been super explicitly said. So I, as someone who doesn't know anything about sort of these big scale projects, I inferred that you would need a contractor. Perhaps that's not true depending on the scale of the project, but I think for this one you would. So a contractor who specializes in the development of public spaces, perhaps a restoration ecologist for the Natural Meadow Restoration Project. You're going to need a trail team to build and develop those miles of hiking trail. I've been saying for a long time that I think We need another sort of trail program to get young people back to work, whether it's an expansion of AmeriCorps or something, but I think that's a great use. Anyway, supplies listed in the itemized budget. Again, just to harp home, the
Did we lose Sophia? I can't hear her.
I don't hear her either. I think we may have lost her.
Okay, thanks. All right, so we were on number 8, resources. And so Lisa put in the chat box, a survey engineer, architectural design, construction oversight, permitting, grading, and inspections, yes. All right, how about we move on to number 9? What is the estimated total cost? How is this cost broken down? Somebody like to raise their hand, come off mute, and answer this one? Sophia, are
okay.
you back?
Hey, I'm back.
Okay.
I think so.
Move us on to number 9.
Sorry, I was trying to limit my bandwidth by keeping my video off, but that didn't do anything. Okay, what's the total estimated cost, and how is that cost broken down? I literally just copied and pasted from the budget. Cool. I'm going to assume that everybody else was able to do that too. Great. Okay, and then what are the broad categories of community needs or opportunities does this project address? Can we get one last volunteer to come off mute? Yeah, go for it.
Sure. We've got recreation and natural and historical conservation.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, I also had improved quality of life, since that was explicitly mentioned as one of the missions or purpose of the county commissioners. Okay, great. So we have gone over this worksheet. Do people have any, before we start to move on to talking about clear writing tips, does anybody have any last questions or thoughts about sort of this process of filling out this type of worksheet, what reviewers are looking for, what you should look for in your own proposals before you press that submit button? Melissa, was that, or is that your hand up from before?
Actually, well, I do still have a question.
Okay, yeah.
But it's not so much about the worksheet, but on the budget, 3 of the line items have exactly the same dollar amount. Towards the bottom, the well, septic, and bridge repairs are all supposed to cost exactly $17,887. That just looks weird to me.
Yeah, so I don't know, perhaps somebody with more knowledge of Part F specifically could come off mute and describe that. My knee-jerk reaction is that probably somewhere in the RFP, there's a way that they have like these specific things coded and they want a number in each of the lines. And so even if those 3 are sort of compressed together, they might, but then again, it's redundant funding. And so it is additive. Anyway, I'm not sure if that's a good question that I'll pass to somebody else.
So Robin is with Bertie County, and she commented in the chat box that the estimate was obtained together. So it was probably one figure for those 3 things, and then they just divided by 3 so that they'd have a line item for each.
Cool. Okay, that is helpful. Thank you, Robin. And then Sharon is asking, how does everyone come up with the first budget? Is it just a guess? That is such a good question. So I'm interested in hearing from other people who have experience with developing access grants specifically. If you have ideas on this first budget, I have some ideas generally about grant writing and preparing a first budget, but I'm interested in seeing if other people have information first. Okay, so in general, a couple of things. One, I have been told to always ask for the award ceiling. I don't know that that applies here, but that's just something that I've been told. I've been scolded for only applying for like half of the amount that was asked for, because I was like, well, that's all I personally need. Like that's all I personally need, but your organization might need that full amount of money for that project and administration costs or something like that, right? Like in terms of piecing together funding for leveraging, you might just always need that full amount. So there's that. Second, is if you're not starting with that, is thinking about, okay, maybe your project is already in phase 1 and so you're looking for phase 2 funding. How much, you might already know what's incorporated in phase 2 and what specific things you want from specific funders, right? So you might already know what a cost of something is. But we've been talking about budget specificity, right? So I think that the best thing that you can do is think about what you want, what you need, what those things cost, and then that can be your starting point, and you can sort of think about where you might shift dollars around from leveraging or other things, if that makes sense. But I would always just start with sort of the most complex budget, and then you can always pare back. Okay, Ashley says, we like to know the max from the funders, but don't always max out their requests. We obtain budget numbers through close communication with subcontractors. Yep. For accurate labor estimates, we use particular percentage for administrative costs. Yes, perfect. Okay, I think that's super helpful context. Okay, so I'm going to change what I'm sharing here for a second. Stop sharing. Brittany says, I start early and get estimates from contractors, architects, planners who develop parks, facilities, projects, such as ours. Consider the impact of inflation. That's a great point. By assuming the project may be completed over several years due to the contracts of funders. Or maybe there's some big disruptive event globally that, anyway, so just be prepared. Okay. Oh, I guess I'm sharing the full screen. So, components of clear writing. I am asking y'all again to share in the chat what you think some components of clear writing are, and I will add them to this screen. So I have a couple examples of things that I look for in clear writing, using the active voice. So giving, let's see, the subject of the sentence, the power of the verb. So for an example, it's more powerful to say, we will, like during phase 1, we will build the gazebo, rather than saying during phase 1, a gazebo will be built, right? Because when you say we are going to build the gazebo, or you specify who is doing the action, that specificity just, it gives you the power, right? Like you're the one doing the work to take the credit for it. And then I say show, don't tell. So meaning back up your assertions with specific data and facts. So we've been talking about like sustainability, demonstrating that you have the ability to be a sustainable organization. Don't just say, we have established that we are competent in developing access sites. You can say, we have demonstrated via Project X, Project Y, and Project Z, and making it to these points in the project that we have the ability to be sustainable. Okay, so Ashley says easily understood language. Not everyone reading the proposal will be an expert in your niche. Yes, so I'm going to say don't use jargon, I think is a good translation of that. Clear language, yes. Limit use of acronyms. Yes, that is on my list. Thank you. So limit use, use of acronyms. And I'm going to, so you say, Jay Powell, don't assume the readers know what they stand for. So I'm going to say define them the first time you use them. Okay, anything else? Wait a couple seconds for some other answers to come in. Okay, another one that I have is avoid slang. And just imprecise terminology. Subject verb agreement, yes, basic stuff. But you'd be surprised how many people still can't figure that out. Verb agreement, succinctness, yes, clear and to the point. Succinct, I guess succinctness isn't a word. Brevity, there we go. Brevity. Brief project narrative justification clearly stated at the beginning of the paragraph. Yes, so your topic sentence of paragraph, I'm going to say a paragraph needs to relate to the rest of the sentences in that paragraph. Don't overwrite or overthink. Yes, Alice, easier said than done. Okay, and I see, consistent tenses. Okay, perfect. All right, and then I'm just going to go to the next slide that I have here. So, this is my number one tip. Read what you write aloud. It will, I promise, help catch your clumsiest language. Sometimes when you're reading things over and over again, it makes sense in your head, and then you say it out loud, and you're like, oh, that's what that sounds like? Ooh. Yes, okay. So I also have a couple other, like, in terms of things to have handy. I really like using grammar and thesaurus and dictionary, like online references and sort of the built-in software. But I also really like The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. It's a super short book, like really this big. And you can usually find it for free online or for like a couple dollars. I just highly recommend it for any writer, regardless of what type of writing you're doing, but especially grant writing. And then the last thing I have is ask for multiple sets of eyes to read your proposal. Okay, so I'm done sharing. Oh, yes. Okay, Sharon, just a couple other things that folks are coming in with as we close out this section. Jonathan says, spelling and pronunciation, or in pronouncing location correctly based on local dialect. Yes, great point. I learned that lesson last week by not pronouncing Curie Beach properly. Jay Powell says that she likes the AP style reference guide, which you can find online. Yes, thank you for sharing that resource. And Sharon says he's a proofreader who knows nothing about the project. I think that's such a good piece of advice, because sometimes you just get so lost in your own sauce and you know what you're talking about, but often the funder might not. And so having a fresh set of eyes that doesn't know anything about it and can be approaching the review and the receipt of your application with sort of the same beginning information or outset as the reviewers will be. Okay, so that is what I have for clear writing tips. I will make sure that all of the things from the chat and these slides get to y'all by the, I guess probably tomorrow, but all of this information will come to you in some form. So thank you for your attention and participation, and I will hand it over to our last interview.
Thank you, Sophia. Appreciate all your time and work on putting those tips together for us. So our last interview is with the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and Chris Schmidt is here from the Division of Parks and Rec, and she will be interviewed by Rachel Love Adrick with the Division of Coastal Management.
Good morning, Chris. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. Can we start? Can you tell us all a little bit about your program and what you fund?
Well, the Land and Water Conservation Fund provides matching grants for acquisition, development, and renovation of public outdoor recreation sites and facilities. So, I mean, that could be sports and play fields, playgrounds, picnic facilities, trails, boating facilities, fishing, hunting facilities, outdoor pools, camping, amphitheaters, really an array of outdoor rec facilities.
Do you have an example, perhaps from the coast, that you'd like to share?
Well, let's see. Example. I should have thought about this before we came on. We certainly have. I'm thinking of not on the coast at the moment, but the Wake County Turnip Seed Nature Preserve is It's an LWCF project, and I'm totally drawing a blank. We have over 1,000 projects in the state that are state and local, and Holly Street Park in Rocky Mount is a recent one that just closed. That's more a community park. So two totally different examples there between the Nature Preserve and Holly Street Park in Rocky Mount.
Okay, thank you. So where does the funding come from for this program?
Well, the program is administered by the Department of the Interior, and their authority has been delegated to the National Park Service. But the funding comes from annual congressional appropriations, and it's also supplemented by revenues from offshore drilling that are pursuant to GOMESA, which is the Gulf of Mexico Energy Securities Act.
Okay. How much money is available each year?
Of course, it's varied over the years. LWCF was quite lean for a number of years, but with the recent passing of the Great American Outdoors Act last year, we have seen significant increase in funding, and 2021 appropriations for the state of North Carolina is $7.1 million, and that will be split amongst state projects and local projects.
So who is eligible to apply for that funding?
Well, for the stateside program, which we manage for the Park Service, it is state parks, local governments, your counties and municipalities, and recognized Indian tribes are also eligible.
Okay. Can you briefly describe the RFP and any elements that are expected in a proposal, and then perhaps highlight what you feel is the most important aspects?
Yes, of course, there's the project description. The bulk of the application is the federal, and let me preface, I need to preface, we had some major changes that were just released last week in the final hours of the Trump administration. The Secretary of the Interior released a new Secretary order and LWCF manual. So there have been some priorities added to the program. We still are waiting on some advisement from the National Park Service on exactly how that's going to impact the program as it trickles down to the states and project eligibility. We do expect there may be some additional changes after the new administration reviews the new order and manual changes. So things aren't necessarily concrete right now. Also, we recently received a release of new forms, and so things are a little in influx at the moment. So I'll do my best to answer, but I'll be speaking mostly on, I guess, how things have been managed to date, but just keep in mind there could be some changes coming as we interpret the new manual and implement the secretary's order. So, but with the application, there's a project description, what was formerly known as the PDESF, federal form, the environmental screening form, which is the bulk of the application. Of course, your budget, source of matching funds, boundary map, site plan, location map, conceptual plan if your development, if this is acquisition only or if your development's going to be delayed. You'll, of course, need the review from the State Historic Preservation Office. Now, with LWCF, appraisals are required, and they must be what we refer to as yellow book appraisals. So that's the uniform appraisal standard for federal land acquisitions. It's just a different standard of appraisal from what people are accustomed to getting with the use tax appraisals. Proof of ownership, and also one of the main focuses is how the project will achieve goals of the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan, which the state just had a new plan adopted that in last year in 2020. That is on the state parks website, so you can reference that. But there are 6 issues and goals identified in that planning document, and so the proposed project should meet some of those goals.
Okay. Sounds like y'all are got a lot, or you're working through a lot right now.
Yes.
So you did mention that there was a matching requirement. What is that requirement, and are there any limits on where that funding can come from?
Yes, we match up to 50%. It depends on the total project, on what your reimbursement rate will actually be with the federal share versus the state share. So, but up to a maximum of 50%. Most federal funds are not eligible for match with LWCF. There are a few exceptions. RTP is an exception. But generally, other federal funds are not eligible for match.
So could other state funds be used?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any insights on leveraging money with your grant program?
It's just the timing is a little tricky, obviously. That's the main thing to be cognizant of are your time frames that you have. The application process from application date to contract date with LWCF is a little slow, so that makes it even a little more difficult, I think, when you're doing that. But yes, people have done that, leverage funds with Partis funds and other funds, but you just have to be really careful with the timeline.
Okay, so what is the RFP, the timing? When is it available? When is it due?
And again, with possible changes coming to our the program and application, these are not set in stone, but right now our intent is to release the application in March with an October 1st deadline. And then you could probably expect things to go to contract maybe February or March of 2022.
Do you have is it a pre-application and a final application, or just one application?
Just one application.
Okay. So the next question is, has COVID impacted your funding or ability to, or any other aspects of the program? It sounds like the new administration has made.
Right, yes. Yes, so COVID directly, I would say no. I mean, we postponed our application deadline last year, just as everybody was, kind of scrambling, adjusting to COVID. Honestly, COVID for parks in general, there has been a silver lining. I think it has showcased to everybody just how important our public outdoor places are. But the Great American Outdoors Act has impacted us more than anything. Like I said, we've seen a 31% increase in appropriations for this year, and that's a direct result of the Great American Outdoors Act.
Okay. I forget, I can't remember. Do you guys acquire land with this grant program?
You can, yes.
Are there any limits on the type of development that could occur with land acquired through your program?
Well, it is for outdoor recreation. Indoor facilities are generally not acceptable within LWCF boundary. That's not always the case. A nature interpretive center could certainly be approved. We have, visitor centers and state parks that have been supported by LWCF. The main thing is that the facility, it must support outdoor recreation on site. So that's the main thing for these indoor, so support facilities are allowed as long as they're supporting the outdoor recreation on site, and that it's not the main focus of the grant. So, and also one thing with LWCF is that it is for public outdoor recreation in perpetuity.
So it has to be available to the public, couldn't be like on a military base or.
Correct.
So Whitney, could you pull up the site plan and we can go over and look at what different aspects the program could fund? Thank you.
Yeah, and again, this is pretty easy for me with LWCF. Yes, planning costs are eligible within a certain period of time of pre-award dates, and the pier and your shoreline improvements, the boat ramps would certainly be eligible through LWCF. Sewage pump out as well, the docking, parking as a support facility certainly would be eligible. Your other, restrooms, picnic shelters, yes. Your other site amenities, landscaping, lighting, signage, things like that would be eligible. That your furnishings, if they're permanent, LWCF will not support mobile or temporary amenities, but yeah, if you have, benches and trash cans and things that are secured in there, then yes, they're also eligible. So
I'm hearing a lot of overlap between all of the programs that have presented today, so it's maybe more of a timing and contract kind of issue to work out between all the different programs.
Yeah.
Okay. To close out, do you have any grant management tips for someone who's awarded funds through your program?
I just follow the directions in the in the application. Follow directions is the main thing. But yes, getting started early. I'm sure these are not new tips. I'm sure it's been repeated last week and today. So, but get started early and just follow the directions, and yeah, so the best thing I can offer.